It was a Tuesday evening in early June, and the sky over Grand Island, Nebraska had been threatening all day. The heat hung heavy and wet, pressing down on the flat farmland like a damp blanket that nobody could shake off. People moved slow, their clothes sticking to their skin, and the air felt thick enough to chew. By late afternoon, the clouds started building to the west, towering white giants turning gray at the edges, then dark and ugly at the base. The kind of sky that makes you stop and stare and feel a knot tighten in your stomach. The National Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm watch earlier that morning, but that was nothing new for June in Nebraska. Folks around here knew what summer storms could do. They had seen hail peel paint off a barn and lightning split a tree clean in two, but nobody expected what was about to happen on June 3rd, 1980. Nobody expected the night of the twisters. The town of Grand Island sat in the middle of the Platte River Valley, a quiet community of about 33,000 people. It was a place where folks knew each other by name, where the high school football games packed the stands, and where the biggest worry on a summer evening might be whether the air conditioning could keep up with the heat. That Tuesday, the air conditioning was working overtime in the Miller family's house on the south side of town. Tom Miller had come home from his job at the grain elevator around 5:30, tired and sweaty, and had immediately cranked the window unit in the living room to high. His wife Sarah was in the kitchen, pulling together a cold dinner because nobody had the appetite for anything hot. Their two kids, 10-year-old Danny and 7-year-old Emily, were sprawled on the living room floor in front of the television, watching cartoons and complaining about boredom. Tom walked through the living room and paused to look out the big picture window that faced west. The sky had turned a strange greenish color, the kind of green that old-timers said meant trouble. He had heard that all his life, but he had never really seen it up close before. Now he was seeing it, and it made him uneasy. He called to Sarah in the kitchen. She came in drying her hands on a dish towel and stood beside him looking out at the horizon. The clouds were rolling and churning like something alive was stirring inside them. She said it looked like it might rain hard. Tom nodded, but he kept staring. There was a weird stillness to the air, a quiet that seemed wrong. The birds had stopped singing. The neighborhood dogs had gone silent. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. At about 6:45, the first tornado warning came over the radio. Tom had the old transistor sitting on the kitchen counter, tuned to the local station. The announcer's voice broke through the static with a sudden urgency. The National Weather Service had spotted a severe thunderstorm capable of producing tornadoes moving east toward Hall County. Tom turned up the volume. Sarah brought the kids into the kitchen so they could all hear. Danny asked if a tornado was coming. Tom said maybe, but they needed to be ready. He had always kept a small emergency kit in the basement closet, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a battery-powered radio, a few bottles of water, and an old blanket. He told Sarah to grab the kit while he checked the windows and doors. The kids started looking nervous, so Sarah tried to sound calm as she led them down the basement stairs. The basement in the Miller house was not finished. It was a concrete room with a dirt floor in one corner, old wooden shelves lined with canned goods and jars, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A few boxes of Christmas decorations sat stacked against the wall. It was dark and smelled like damp earth and dust, but it was safe. That was what mattered. Tom came down a minute later, his footsteps heavy on the wooden steps. He had the transistor radio in his hand and he set it on a shelf next to the flashlight. The station was now playing a recorded message about taking cover immediately. The storm was getting closer. Tom sat on an old wooden chair and the kids huddled on the blanket with Sarah. They listened to the wind outside beginning to pick up, a low moan that grew into a howl. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. The basement went pitch black except for the single beam of the flashlight that Tom switched on. Emily started to cry. Sarah pulled her close and whispered that everything would be fine. Danny sat stiff and silent, staring at the flashlight beam on the ceiling. Tom tried the radio, but it only emitted static now. The wind outside was roaring, a sound like a freight train passing right over their heads. And then they heard a different sound, a deep, grinding rumble that seemed to shake the concrete walls. The house groaned. Something upstairs crashed, glass shattered. Sarah screamed. Tom grabbed the kids and pulled them into the corner, away from the shelves. The roar grew so loud it filled every inch of the basement, vibrated in their chests, made their ears ache. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound began to fade. The wind dropped. The grinding rumble moved away, growing softer and softer until there was only the sound of rain and the drip of water from somewhere above. They stayed in the corner for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. Nobody spoke. Finally, Tom stood up and walked to the bottom of the stairs. He called up, but there was no answer. He climbed slowly, flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him. The door at the top of the stairs was gone, just a jagged hole where it had been. He stepped into what used to be the kitchen. The roof was open to the sky. Rain was falling on the wreckage of cabinets and appliances. The living room was worse. The picture window was blown out, the couch was upside down, and the television was gone. He could see through the hole in the wall into the night where the clouds were still rolling, but the greenish tint had faded to a dull gray. The tornado had passed directly over their house. Tom called down to Sarah that it was safe to come up. She brought the kids up slowly, their eyes wide at the destruction. The house was still standing, but barely. The roof was missing over half the rooms and the walls were leaning. Neighbors were starting to come out of their own houses, calling to each other in the dark. Some houses nearby were flattened, others looked untouched. It was a strange patchwork pattern of damage. The air smelled of wet wood, torn insulation, and something like gas. Tom told Sarah to stay with the kids while he walked up the street to see if anyone needed help. He had barely taken 10 steps when he heard the sirens again. Not the ambulance or fire truck. The tornado sirens. They were wailing across the whole town, a long, steady rise and fall that sent a chill down his spine. He turned back toward his house, shouting for Sarah to get the kids back into the basement. Sarah was already moving, grabbing Emily by the hand and pulling Danny along. Tom ran after them. They clattered down the stairs, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The radio came back to life with a burst of static and a frantic voice. This was not a test. Another tornado had been spotted on the ground, moving east through the northern part of Grand Island, and then another, and another. The voice said there might be as many as 6 separate tornadoes, a family of twisters, all spawned from the same supercell that was now parked right over the city. The Millers huddled in the basement again, but this time the wait was different. The first tornado had been a surprise, a sudden punch that came and went. Now they knew what was coming, and they knew it could be worse. The radio kept crackling with updates. Tornado on Highway 281, tornado near the Fauner Park Fairgrounds, tornado touching down in the residential areas near the railroad tracks. The names of streets and landmarks became a litany of destruction. The wind outside picked up again, but this time it was not a single roar. It was a chorus of roars, overlapping, shifting in pitch, sometimes fading and then rising again. Tom realized they were hearing multiple tornadoes at different distances, all moving around the city like a pack of wild animals hunting through the dark. In the basement, the minutes stretched into an hour. The flashlight began to dim, so Tom switched it off to save the batteries. They sat in complete darkness, listening. The radio was their only link to the world above, and the news it brought was worse with every report. There were injuries, there were fatalities. The entire south side of town had been hit. The north side had been hit again. The hospital was overflowing. The sirens never stopped. Sarah prayed out loud, a quiet murmur that the kids could barely hear. Danny held his mother's hand and tried not to cry. Emily had fallen asleep from exhaustion, her head in Sarah's lap. Then, around 9:30, the radio announced that the storm was finally moving east out of Hall County. The tornado warning was being allowed to expire. But the announcer warned that debris fields were still dangerous, that downed power lines were everywhere, and that people should stay where they were until daylight unless they had a life-threatening emergency. Tom turned the flashlight back on, the beam weak but usable. He looked at Sarah. Her face was pale and streaked with tears. Danny looked scared but steady. Emily stirred but did not wake. Tom said they should wait a little longer, make sure it was really over. He did not want to take them back up into that nightmare only to have to run down again. They waited another half hour. The radio went silent for a while, then came back with a list of shelters that had been set up at the high school and the church downtown. Tom decided it was time to see what was left of their world. He climbed the stairs once more, stepping carefully over the wreckage. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with humidity and the smell of broken things. The sky was clearing and a sliver of moon offered just enough light to see the shape of the neighborhood. It was unrecognizable. Houses were missing, trees were snapped off at the base, cars were overturned, a bathtub lay in the middle of the street, a child's bicycle hung from a telephone pole. The Millers' house was still standing, but it was one of the few on their block that was. 20 yards away, the Johnsons' house was flat. 60 yards the other direction, the Harrisons' house was missing its entire second floor. Tom stood on what used to be his front lawn, now a field of debris, and tried to make sense of the destruction. The tornadoes had danced across Grand Island in a chaotic pattern, skipping some houses and destroying others, carving random paths of ruin. It was as if something evil had walked through the town, deciding which homes to crush and which to spare. The Millers had been lucky. But as Tom looked around at the shattered neighborhood, he knew that luck was a thin word for what they had survived. He turned to go back inside to get his family, and that was when he heard the sirens again. But this time, they were not the warning sirens. They were the sirens of ambulances and police cars converging from every direction, their wails blending into one endless cry that would echo through the streets for the rest of the night. Tom stood frozen for a moment, the sirens washing over him like a second storm. The sound was different now, urgent and purposeful, not a warning but a response. Red and blue lights flickered through the gaps in the wrecked houses, painting the debris in flashes of color. He turned back to his house, or what was left of it, and called down to Sarah. She came up with Danny, carrying Emily, who was still half asleep. They stood together on the lawn, a family of four surrounded by the ruins of their street. The first person they saw was Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, stumbling over the rubble in her nightgown, barefoot and bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Sarah guided her to sit on an overturned porch step and used a piece of torn sheet to press against the wound. Mrs. Patterson was in shock, repeating the same words over and over. "It came through the roof, it came through the roof." Tom asked if her husband was okay, and she shook her head, staring at the ground. Tom did not push. He knew there would be time for questions later, and he was not sure he wanted the answers yet. The sirens kept coming. A fire truck crawled down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating scenes that were better left in shadow. A man was digging through a pile of lumber that used to be his garage, calling his dog's name. A woman sat on a curb holding a child, both of them covered in dust, not moving, not speaking. The firemen moved methodically, checking houses, calling out for anyone who could hear them. Tom waved them over and they checked on Mrs. Patterson, loading her into the back of the truck with 2 other people who had been found wandering the street. Tom asked one of the firemen if there was anything they could do. The fireman, young and exhausted, looked at Tom with eyes that had seen too much in one night. He said to stay put for now, to help any neighbors who came by, and to watch for gas leaks and downed wires. He handed Tom a flashlight with fresh batteries and moved on. The night stretched on like that, a long, slow crawl through the dark, punctuated by the sound of sirens and the occasional crack of a weakened structure settling. Around midnight, Danny tugged at Tom's sleeve and said he was cold. Tom realized he had not thought about blankets or coats. The house was open to the sky and the temperature had dropped. He led the family back inside, stepping carefully over the debris. The basement was still intact and the air down there was warmer. They gathered what they could carry from the wrecked kitchen: a few cans of food, a manual can opener, some bottles of water that had survived. They set up a small camp in the corner of the basement, using cushions from the destroyed couch to make a place to sit. Emily woke up fully now, asking where her doll was. Sarah did not know. The doll was probably somewhere in the rubble upstairs, or maybe it had been carried away by the wind, tossed into some field miles from here. Sarah told Emily that they would find a new doll, a better one, as soon as the stores opened again. Emily seemed to accept that, but her eyes kept drifting to the stairwell, as if expecting the doll to come walking down on its own. Tom found a battery-powered lantern in the basement, one they kept for camping trips. He turned it on and the warm glow pushed back the darkness. It felt like a small victory. They ate cold beans from the can, passing it around, not talking much. The radio was still crackling with updates, but the tone had changed. The emergency operators were shifting from warnings to logistics, coordinating shelters, listing road closures, asking for volunteers with chainsaws and 4-wheel-drive trucks. The storm was gone, but the work was just beginning. At 2 in the morning, a neighbor from 2 blocks over came knocking on what was left of their front door. His name was Carl, a retired farmer with a gray beard and a calm voice that seemed out of place in the chaos. He said he was going door to door, checking on people, making sure everyone had a place to stay for the night. He told them that the high school shelter was open and that they could go there if they wanted. Tom looked at Sarah and she shook her head. They were safe here for now, and the basement felt like their territory, a small piece of normal in a world that had been turned upside down. Carl understood and left them a phone number for the Red Cross. He said they would come by in the morning with supplies. Tom thanked him and watched him walk away, his flashlight beam bobbing over the wreckage. The night was quiet now, except for the occasional distant siren and the sound of water dripping from broken pipes. Tom sat down next to Sarah, his back against the concrete wall, and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, not really. He just let his mind drift, replaying the events of the night in fragments that did not quite fit together. At some point, the sky began to lighten. It was a slow process, a gradual shift from black to gray to pale blue. Tom climbed the stairs one more time and stood in the shell of his kitchen, watching the sun rise over the destruction. The light revealed details that the darkness had hidden. The front porch was gone, torn away at the foundation. The garage was a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. The car, a 1978 station wagon, was on its side in the driveway, its windows blown out. But the house itself, despite the missing roof and the leaning walls, was still standing. It was a miracle or luck or something else that Tom did not have a name for. He walked outside, stepping over the debris that covered the yard. The street was a mess of fallen trees, shredded siding, and broken glass. A mailbox lay in the middle of the road, its flag still up as if waiting for the mailman. Tom picked it up and set it on the curb, a small gesture of order in the chaos. He looked up at the sky, clear now, and thought about the night before. The green clouds, the roar of the wind, the shaking ground. It felt like a dream, but the wreckage around him was real, and the sirens were still singing their mournful song in the distance. Sarah came up with the kids. They stood together on the lawn, looking at the damage in the gray morning light. Danny pointed to a tree that had been snapped in half, its top resting on the roof of the neighbor's house. Emily asked if they could go see the swings at the park. Sarah said the park was probably not open today. Tom put his arm around Sarah and she leaned into him, her body trembling slightly. They had survived the night, but the day ahead was uncertain, and the days after that even more so. A truck rumbled down the street, a pickup with a flatbed loaded with water bottles and blankets. A man in a red vest jumped out and handed Tom a case of water and a stack of blankets. He said the Red Cross was setting up a distribution point at the corner of 3rd and Elm. Tom thanked him and carried the supplies into the basement. They set up a small area with the blankets, making a nest for the kids to rest in. Emily lay down and was asleep in minutes. Danny sat with his back to the wall, his eyes still wide, but the fear had softened into something like acceptance. Tom sat next to him and asked if he was okay. Danny nodded, but then he started talking. He said he remembered the sound of the tornado, not the loud part, but the quiet before it, when the air got still and the birds stopped singing. He said he had never heard a silence like that before and he never wanted to hear it again. Tom listened and did not interrupt. Sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was just to let them talk. The morning wore on and the neighborhood slowly came back to life, or at least to motion. People emerged from basements and from under porches, from cars and from ditches, places where they had taken shelter when the tornadoes came. They walked through the streets, dazed and disoriented, searching for familiar landmarks that were no longer there. A woman found her front door, still intact, leaning against a tree and sat down on it, crying. A man climbed onto the roof of his collapsed garage and waved a flag, signaling that he was okay. The community was battered, but it was still there, and that counted for something. Around mid-morning, a group of volunteers arrived from a town 20 miles away, carrying chainsaws and coolers of food. They went to work without asking for directions, clearing fallen trees from driveways, cutting paths through the debris. Tom joined them, taking a chainsaw and cutting up a large branch that had fallen across Mrs. Patterson's driveway. The work was hard, but it was something to do, something that felt productive. Sarah stayed with the kids, helping to sort through the wreckage of their home, finding a few salvageable items, a photo album, Danny's baseball glove, a pot that had somehow survived. By noon, the Red Cross had set up a tent at the corner of their block, serving sandwiches and coffee. Tom took a break and walked over, grabbing a cup of coffee that was too hot but tasted like normalcy. He stood with a group of neighbors, comparing stories, trying to piece together what had happened. Someone said there had been 7 tornadoes, maybe more. Someone else said the storm had been tracked by radar, but no one had expected it to be that bad. They talked about the sirens, about whether they had worked, about whether they had come soon enough. The opinions varied, but the consensus was that the sirens had saved lives, even if they had not saved homes. A man in a National Guard uniform came by with a clipboard, asking for names and addresses, assessing the damage. Tom gave him their information, and the man marked something on his clipboard and moved on. There was a strange detachment to the whole process, a bureaucratic calm that contrasted with the chaos around them. But Tom understood. They had to start somewhere, and paperwork was as good a place as any. The afternoon brought more volunteers, more trucks, more supplies. The neighborhood began to look less like a war zone and more like a construction site. People were cleaning up, hauling debris to the curb, stacking lumber for salvage. Tom found a hammer and a box of nails in the rubble and started repairing what he could. He nailed a piece of plywood over the hole where the kitchen door had been. He propped up a fallen section of the porch. It was not much, but it was something. Sarah spent the afternoon with the kids, walking through the neighborhood, visiting with the neighbors. Danny helped an elderly man pick up the scattered pieces of his tool shed. Emily found a cat scared and dirty and convinced her mother to let her keep it. The cat had no collar, no tags, and was probably someone's pet, but in the chaos of the night, no one came to claim it. Sarah said they would take it to the vet when things calmed down, but for now it could stay. The cat curled up in Emily's lap and started purring, a small sound of warmth and comfort in a cold, broken world. As the sun began to set, the Millers gathered in the basement one more time. They had a hot meal brought by a church group from a nearby town, and they shared it with the cat, who ate hungrily. Tom lit the lantern and they sat in a circle, the light casting long shadows on the concrete walls. The radio was still on, but it was quiet now, playing music instead of news. The sirens had stopped, at least for now, and the night was still. Tom looked at his family, their faces lit by the soft glow of the lantern, and felt something he had not felt since the storm began. It was not hope exactly. It was more like a stubborn refusal to give in. The tornadoes had taken a lot, but they had not taken everything. They had not taken each other, and as long as they had that, they could rebuild. He said a quiet prayer, not to ask for anything, but to give thanks for what he still had. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. Danny leaned against his shoulder. Emily slept with the cat curled beside her. The night passed slowly, but it passed. And when the next morning came, Tom climbed the stairs again, ready to face another day of wreckage and work and rebuilding. He could see the distant glow of dawn spreading across the horizon, and he thought about the future, about all the days ahead, about the long road to recovery. It would not be easy, but they had made it through the night of the twisters, and that was something. That was everything. He stood at the top of the basement stairs, the morning light filtering through the shattered windows of the house above. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp wood and overturned earth. The street outside was quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a truck or the sound of a distant chainsaw. Tom took a deep breath and stepped out into the yard. The grass was flattened in swirls, like someone had taken a giant hand and brushed it across the lawn. A child's tricycle lay on its side, its wheels still spinning slowly in the breeze. Tom picked it up and set it by the front steps, next to the mailbox he had straightened the day before. It was a small act, but it felt important. Everything felt important now. Sarah followed him out, holding a cup of coffee that had been brought by a volunteer. She handed it to him and wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the growing warmth of the morning. The kids were still asleep downstairs, the cat curled between them. Emily had named the cat Twister, a name that made Tom smile despite everything. He took a sip of the coffee, bitter and hot, and looked around at the neighborhood. Houses that had been whole 2 days ago were now piles of lumber. Cars that had been parked on the street were now crumpled heaps of metal. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped like twigs, but there was also movement. A group of teenagers carrying buckets and brooms walked past, heading toward the community center. A woman was sweeping the debris from her driveway, her broom making a steady swish-swish sound against the concrete. A man was hammering boards over a broken window, the rhythm of the hammer a counterpoint to the distant chainsaws. The neighborhood was coming back to life, piece by piece, nail by nail. Tom finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch railing. He had heard that the National Guard had set up a command post at the high school and that FEMA was expected to arrive later that day. He had also heard that the death toll was rising, that some families had not been as lucky as theirs. He did not want to think about that, not yet. He wanted to focus on what he could do, what he could fix. He found a pair of work gloves in the rubble and put them on. The leather was worn but still intact. It was a good sign. He spent the morning helping the neighbors. Old Mr. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down, had lost his entire roof. His house was still standing, but the roof had been peeled back like a sardine can, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. Tom climbed up with a tarp and a hammer, and he and 2 other men stretched the tarp across the exposed beams, nailing it down as best they could. It was not a permanent fix, but it would keep the rain out until the roofers came. Mr. Patterson stood below, directing them with a shaky voice, his hands trembling as he held a cup of coffee. He thanked them over and over, his eyes wet with gratitude. By noon, Tom was exhausted. His arms ached from the hammering, his back was sore from bending and lifting, and his hands were blistered even through the gloves. He sat down on the curb next to a pile of debris that had been someone's living room. A couch sat upside down, its cushions gone. A television lay on its side, the screen shattered. A family photo album lay open, the pages wet and curling. Tom picked it up and closed it, setting it aside. Maybe the photos could be saved, maybe not, but it seemed wrong to leave them in the dirt. Sarah came by with a sandwich and a bottle of water. She sat down next to him, her jeans stained with mud, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired, but there was a calmness in her eyes that had not been there the day before. She told him that the Red Cross had set up a temporary shelter at the elementary school and that they were offering showers and hot meals. She had taken the kids there earlier and they had played in the gym while she washed her face and hands. She said it felt good to be clean, even if it was just for a moment. Tom ate the sandwich slowly, savoring each bite. It was ham and cheese on white bread, nothing special, but it tasted like heaven. He looked at the damaged houses around him and thought about the work that lay ahead. The insurance adjusters would come, the contractors would come, and eventually the houses would be rebuilt. But the community, the fabric of the neighborhood, that would take longer to mend. He thought about the old oak tree in the park that had been uprooted, the one where he had proposed to Sarah 16 years ago. It was gone now, just a hole in the ground and a tangle of roots. He did not know if they would plant a new one or if the park would ever be the same. But then he looked at Sarah and he remembered that they were still here. The tree was gone, but they were here. The house was damaged, but they were here. They had each other and they had the kids and they had a stubborn, gritty hope that would not let them give up. Tom finished his sandwich and stood up. There was more work to do. The afternoon brought a steady stream of volunteers. A group from a church in Lincoln arrived with a trailer full of food, water, and cleaning supplies. They set up a distribution point in the miller's driveway, passing out bags of ice and boxes of granola bars. The neighborhood women gathered around, sharing stories and offering help. Sarah organized a team to sort through the donated clothes, separating them by size and type. Danny helped carry boxes, his small arms straining under the weight but his face proud. Emily stayed with Twister, who had taken up residence under the porch and was now batting at a piece of string. Tom worked with a chainsaw crew cutting up fallen trees that blocked the roads. They worked in teams, one man cutting, two men hauling the pieces to the curb. The smell of gasoline and fresh-cut wood filled the air, mixing with the dust and the damp. It was hard work, but it was satisfying. At the end of each block, they could see progress, a clear path where there had been a wall of timber. Tom felt like he was doing something, not just standing by and waiting for help. Around 4 o'clock, a truck from the local electric company pulled up. A man in a hard hat got out and walked around, inspecting the downed power lines. He said they would have the power restored to most of the area by the end of the week, but some streets might take longer. Tom nodded, understanding. There was no point in complaining. They had a generator for the basement, and the Red Cross had brought extra batteries for the radio. They could make do. As the evening approached, Tom walked back to his house. The front door was still missing, but he had nailed a piece of plywood over the opening, creating a makeshift barrier. He pushed it aside and stepped inside. The living room was a mess of overturned furniture and broken glass. The ceiling had a hole in it, letting in a sliver of orange light from the setting sun. Tom looked around and felt the weight of the loss settle on his shoulders. This was where Danny had taken his first steps. This was where they had celebrated Christmases and birthdays. This was where they had lived and loved and argued and laughed. Now it was a shell, a hollowed-out hull. Sarah came in behind him and took his hand. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say. They stood together in the wreckage of their home and they let themselves grieve. Not for long, just a moment. Then Sarah let go and started picking up the pieces. She found a picture frame, the glass broken but the photo inside still intact. It was a picture of the four of them at the county fair taken 3 years ago. Danny was missing a front tooth, Emily had a stuffed bear under her arm, and they were both grinning so wide that their eyes were almost shut. Tom smiled despite everything. He took the picture and put it in his pocket. He would have it framed again if he could. That night they ate dinner in the basement again by the glow of the lantern. The generator hummed in the corner and the radio played a distant baseball game. Danny and Emily played a game of cards with the deck they had found in the rubble, the cards warped and stained but still usable. Sarah made sandwiches with the supplies from the church group and they split a bag of potato chips. It was not much, but it was dinner and they were together. Tom lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. There were voices, some laughing, some crying, some just talking in low tones. There were hammers and saws, even after dark, as people worked by flashlight and lantern. There was the occasional bark of a dog or the meow of a cat and the steady hum of the generator. It was the sound of a community digging itself out of the rubble, a sound that was both desperate and determined. He thought about the tornadoes, about the green sky and the roaring wind, about the moment when he had thought they were all going to die. He thought about the sirens and how they had not gone off soon enough, or maybe they had, and he just had not heard. He thought about the families who had lost everything, the ones who had lost loved ones. He knew that in the coming weeks and months the true toll would become clear. There would be funerals and memorials, and there would be stories that would never be told to strangers. But there would also be rebuilding, and there would be new bonds forged in the aftermath. He turned over and looked at Sarah asleep beside him. Her face was peaceful, the lines of worry softened in the dim light. He felt a surge of love for her, so strong it almost hurt. He reached out and touched her hair, and she stirred, mumbling something, then settled back into sleep. Tom closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him. He knew that tomorrow would be another long day, and the day after that, and the day after that. But he also knew that they would survive it. They had survived the night of the twisters, and they had each other, and that was enough. That was everything. The next morning, Tom woke to the sound of rain. It was a soft, steady drizzle, the kind of rain that the farmers would have welcomed a week ago, but now it felt like an insult. The tarp on Mr. Patterson's roof was not going to hold forever, and the exposed interiors of the houses would get wet all over again. Tom pulled on his boots and a rain jacket that was still hanging in the basement, a bit musty but dry. He climbed the stairs and stepped outside, letting the rain hit his face. It was cold, but it was also cleansing, washing away some of the dust and the grime. He walked down the street, checking on the neighbors. Mrs. Patterson was sitting on her porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the rain. She smiled when she saw Tom and thanked him again for the roof. Tom said it was no trouble, and he meant it. He helped her move a few pieces of furniture that had gotten wet, covering them with plastic sheeting. The rain was a setback, but it was not a defeat. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped and the sun came out bright and warm. The water steamed off the debris and the air smelled of wet wood and fresh earth. The neighborhood came alive again, the volunteers returning, the trucks rolling in. Tom saw a familiar face, his brother Mark, who had driven down from Omaha as soon as he had heard. They embraced, not saying much, just holding on. Mark had brought a truckload of supplies, including a chainsaw and a cooler of beer. He said he could stay for a few days and he would help with whatever was needed. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work and exhaustion, of small victories and setbacks. The power came back on Thursday and the water was restored by Friday. The insurance adjuster came and assessed the damage, giving them a number that felt both too high and too low. Tom signed the papers and moved on. He did not have time to dwell on the numbers. By Saturday, the house had a new roof, or at least the beginnings of one. A contractor had come from a town 50 miles away, a man named Bud who had seen his share of tornado damage. He worked quickly and efficiently, and by evening the roof was waterproof if not finished. Tom helped him clean up, and Bud told him stories about other storms he had worked on in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. He said the people always came back, always rebuilt. It was just a matter of time. Tom believed him. He looked around at the neighborhood, at the new roofs and the patched walls, at the fresh piles of lumber and the stacks of shingles, and he saw the signs of recovery. The park was still a mess, and the old oak tree was still gone, but the swings had been repaired and the children were playing again, their laughter rising above the sound of hammers and saws. Danny was out there now, pushing Emily on the swing, their voices carrying on the evening air. Tom and Sarah sat on the porch, their porch, which was now whole again, the railing fixed, the steps replaced. They had a cold drink in their hands and the cat Twister asleep at their feet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the clouds were light and fluffy, the kind of clouds that did not threaten anything. Tom thought about the green clouds that had appeared on that terrible night, and he felt a shiver run down his spine, but it passed and he looked at the sky and saw only beauty. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her. They sat in silence, watching the day end, feeling the peace that comes after a storm. The sirens had not sounded in days, and the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the leaves of the surviving trees. It was a good sound, a gentle sound, a sound that spoke of life and hope and the stubborn persistence of the human spirit. Tom knew that there would be more storms, more nights of twisters, more moments of terror and loss, but he also knew that they would face them, that they would survive them, that they would rebuild and move on. That was what people did. That was what the Miller family did. And as he sat there with his wife beside him and his children playing in the distance, he felt a deep and abiding gratitude for the simple, precious gift of being alive. The night of the twisters had passed and the morning had come, and for Tom that was enough, that was everything. The weeks that followed were measured not in days but in tasks completed, one after another, each one a small victory against the weight of what had happened. Tom found himself rising before dawn, not out of restlessness but out of a quiet urgency to make the most of the daylight. There was always something to do, some piece of the puzzle to fit back into place. The house was slowly becoming a home again, but the process was slower than he had hoped. Every trip to the hardware store was a reminder of how much had been lost, how much still needed to be replaced. The aisles were filled with other faces, other families with the same haunted look in their eyes, and they nodded to each other in a silent understanding that did not need words. Sarah had taken on the task of sorting through the donations that poured in from across the state. Boxes of clothes, canned goods, toys, and blankets arrived daily, and she organized them in the church basement, creating a makeshift store where neighbors could come and take what they needed. It was exhausting work, but she found a kind of peace in it, a purpose that kept her mind from wandering into darker places. She saw the same faces day after day, and she watched as the community slowly pieced itself back together. There was a woman whose wedding dress had been found hanging from a tree, miraculously intact, and she had laughed and cried at the same time when she saw it. There was a young boy who had lost his baseball glove, and a week later a man from a town 50 miles away drove in with a brand new one, just because he had heard the story on the radio. These moments were small, but they were also everything. Tom's brother Mark stayed for a full week, and together they tackled the worst of the heavy work. They cleared the debris from the backyard, stacked the broken lumber for pickup, and dug out the foundation of the tool shed that had been swept clean away. Mark was a quiet man, not given to long speeches, but his presence was a comfort. They worked side by side, sweating in the sun, and when they stopped for lunch, they sat on the porch and ate sandwiches in silence. Mark would sometimes tell a joke, something from his days in the army, and Tom would laugh, not because the joke was funny but because the laughter felt good, felt normal. On the last day, Mark packed up his truck and gave Tom a long hug. He said he would come back if needed, and Tom knew he meant it. They were brothers, and that bond was stronger than any storm. The children had started back to school by the second week. The school building had been damaged, but the gymnasium was intact, and classes were held there in shifts. Danny and Emily were hesitant at first, nervous about seeing their friends, about facing the questions they knew would come. But the other children had their own stories, their own losses, and the shared experience created a strange kind of intimacy. The teachers were patient and understanding, and the lessons were often set aside for group discussions about what had happened and how they felt. The school counselor, a woman named Linda, held sessions for the children and encouraged them to draw pictures or write stories about the night of the twisters. Danny drew a picture of the family huddled in the basement, the green sky visible through the window, and he colored the tornadoes with black and red crayons, making them look like angry monsters. Linda hung it on the wall and Danny felt a small surge of pride. He had made something out of the fear and it was okay. Emily had a harder time. She was younger and the memories were more jumbled in her mind. She would wake up in the middle of the night, crying, and Sarah would hold her and rock her until she fell back asleep. Sometimes Emily would ask questions that Tom did not know how to answer. She wanted to know where the tornadoes had gone, whether they would come back, whether Mr. Higgins had died because he stayed upstairs. Tom did his best, saying that the tornadoes were gone, that they might not come back for a long time, that Mr. Higgins had made a choice and that it was not her fault. He did not know if the answers were right, but he knew that he had to give them, had to offer some kind of reassurance even when he felt none himself. The community held a memorial service at the end of the month. It was held in the high school football field, which had been cleared of debris and decorated with flags and flowers. The bleachers were full and people stood along the sidelines, shoulder to shoulder. The mayor spoke and the pastor from the church spoke and a woman whose husband had died sang a hymn that made everyone cry. There was a moment of silence and the only sound was the wind and the distant call of a bird. Tom held Sarah's hand and Danny and Emily stood close, their faces solemn. They were remembering the ones who had not made it, the families that had been torn apart. There were 12 names read aloud, 12 people whose stories had ended on that terrible night. Tom did not know all of them, but he knew Mr. Higgins and he knew a man named Chuck who had lived 3 streets over, a man who had been a volunteer firefighter and had died when a wall collapsed on him. He thought about them, about their families, about the empty chairs that would never be filled again. It was a heavy feeling, but there was also a lightness in the air, a sense of shared grief that somehow made the burden easier to carry. After the service, people lingered, talking and hugging, sharing stories and memories. Tom saw Mrs. Patterson talking to a woman he did not recognize, and he saw that she was laughing, a real laugh that came from her belly. It was a good sign. He saw the young boy with the new baseball glove tossing a ball with his father, the first time he had seen them playing together since the storm. He saw the woman whose wedding dress had been found, wearing it now, transformed into a white t-shirt and jeans, smiling brightly. Life was returning slowly, unevenly, but returning nonetheless. That night, the Miller family sat on the porch again, watching the stars. The sky was clear and the moon was a thin crescent hanging low over the horizon. Tom had bought a new telescope, a replacement for the one that had been destroyed, and he set it up on the porch railing. Danny and Emily took turns looking at the moon and the stars, and they made up names for the constellations they saw. There was the big spoon and the little dragon and a cluster of stars that Emily insisted looked like a kitten. Tom laughed and Sarah laughed, and the sound of their laughter carried into the night. The days grew longer and the work continued. The neighborhood was slowly transforming, the scars of the storm fading under fresh paint and new siding. The old oak tree was replaced with a sapling, a small thing that would take years to grow, but it was a start. The park was rebuilt, the playground equipment replaced with sturdier models, and the grass was reseeded. By the time summer arrived, the town was whole again, at least on the surface. There were still moments when the tragedy surfaced, a sudden memory triggered by a sound or a smell, but those moments became less frequent, less sharp. Tom took a job with a construction crew that was rebuilding houses across the county. He worked long hours swinging a hammer and hauling lumber, and he found that the physical labor helped quiet his mind. He learned new skills and he made new friends, men and women who had been through similar storms in other places. They talked about the work, about the weather, about anything except the night of the twisters. But sometimes, late in the day, when the work was done and the tools were put away, one of them would tell a story and Tom would listen, and he would understand that he was not alone. By the end of summer, the Miller house was almost back to normal. The walls were painted, the floors were replaced, and the furniture was new, though it felt strange to sit on a couch that had never been used. Sarah had hung new curtains, bright yellow ones that brought sunlight into the living room. Tom had built a bookshelf and filled it with the books they had saved, the ones that had been stored in the basement. The picture from the county fair was framed again, and it hung on the wall in the hallway, a reminder of who they had been and who they still were. The cat Twister had grown fat and lazy, spending most of his days sleeping in the sun and his nights prowling the yard. He seemed to have forgotten the storm entirely, and there was something comforting in that, in the way that animals could move on without looking back. Tom watched him sometimes, envying his simple existence, his ability to live in the moment without the weight of memory. But he also knew that memory was what made them human, what gave meaning to the days. He would not trade the memories, not even the bad ones, because they were part of the story, part of the life he had lived and would continue to live. One evening in early September, the family drove out to the cemetery where Mr. Higgins was buried. It was a small graveyard on the edge of town, surrounded by fields of corn that were tall and green. They stood by the headstone, a simple granite marker with his name and the dates of his life. Tom had brought a small American flag because Mr. Higgins had been a veteran, and he placed it at the base of the stone. Sarah had brought a bouquet of flowers, and Danny and Emily each laid a stone on the grave, a tradition from Sarah's side of the family, a sign that they had visited and that they remembered. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind rustling the corn, the sun setting behind the hills. And then they walked back to the car and they drove home and they had dinner and they lived. That night, Tom lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft breathing of his wife beside him. It was a normal sound, the sound of home, and he felt a deep gratitude for it, a gratitude that he knew would never fully fade. He thought about the night of the twisters, about the fear and the chaos, about the moment when he had thought it was the end. He thought about how close they had come, how fragile life really was. And he thought about how lucky they were, how fortunate to have survived, to have each other, to have this quiet moment in the dark. He closed his eyes, and he let the memories drift away, not forgotten but set aside, like a book that had been read and put back on the shelf. There would be other storms, he knew, other nights of terror and loss. But there would also be other mornings, other moments of peace, other chances to rebuild and to love. And that was the truth of it, the truth that had carried him through the darkest hours and would carry him through whatever came next. The night of the twisters had passed and the morning had come and they were still here, still together, still alive. That was enough, that was everything. And yet, even as Tom lay there in the quiet dark, he knew that the story was not over. The night of the twisters had passed, but its echoes would ripple through the years, shaping the lives of everyone who had lived through it in ways they could not yet imagine. For the Miller family, the recovery was not a single event but a slow, ongoing process, a series of small moments that added up to something larger than any one of them could see. There would be anniversaries, each one bringing a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a day set aside to remember the fear and the loss, but also the survival and the help. There would be new storms too, not just tornadoes but other kinds of storms, the kind that tested marriages and friendships and faith. And through it all they would hold on to each other because that was the only thing that had ever made sense. The years passed and the town of Grand Island changed. New families moved in, drawn by the affordable housing and the sense of community that had been forged in the aftermath of the disaster. The old oak tree that had been replaced with a sapling grew tall and strong, and children climbed its branches just as Danny and Emily had once climbed the original. The park was rebuilt again, this time with a memorial garden dedicated to the 12 who had died, a quiet place with benches and flowers and a stone plaque engraved with their names. Tom sometimes walked past it on his way to work, and he would stop for a moment, not to pray but simply to remember, to let the names settle in his mind like a litany. Mr. Higgins, Chuck, the others whose faces he had never known but whose stories had become part of his own. Danny grew up and went to college, studying engineering, building things that would stand firm against the wind. He married a woman from Omaha, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they named the boy Thomas after his grandfather. Emily became a teacher, working at the elementary school where she had once been a student, and she taught her students about weather and safety and how to stay calm when the sirens blew. She told them about the night of the twisters, not to scare them but to prepare them, to help them understand that even in the worst moments there was hope. And Sarah, who had spent her life working in insurance, retired and took up painting, filling canvases with landscapes of the Nebraska plains, with rolling fields and big skies and the occasional storm cloud on the horizon. Tom never stopped working. He retired from the construction crew at 65, but he stayed busy helping neighbors with repairs, volunteering at the community center, telling stories to anyone who would listen. He became something of a local historian, the keeper of the memory of that night. People would come to him, especially around the anniversary, and ask him what it had been like, how he had survived what he had lost. He always told them the truth about the fear, about the darkness, about the man named Mr. Higgins who had given his life to save a stranger. He told them about the boy with the baseball glove and the woman with the wedding dress, and he told them about the cat named Twister who had taught them something about resilience. He did not tell the stories to make himself a hero because he was not one. He told them because they needed to be told, because forgetting would be a kind of second death, a loss of all that had been learned in the fire of that terrible night. And then one evening in the spring of 2000, 20 years after the storm, the family gathered again on the porch of the Miller house. The porch had been rebuilt 3 times, enlarged once, and now it wrapped around the front of the house, a comfortable space with rocking chairs and a swing and a table where Sarah set out lemonade and cookies. Danny and his wife were there with their children, little Thomas and his sister, Lily. Emily had come with her husband, a quiet man named Mark who taught history at the high school. They sat together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had filled the sky on that long-ago evening when the tornadoes had come. The children played in the yard, chasing fireflies, their laughter rising and falling like the wind. Tom watched them from his rocking chair, a smile on his face that did not quite reach his eyes. He was thinking about the night, about the sound of the sirens, about the roar that had seemed to swallow the world. He was thinking about Mr. Higgins, about the flag he had placed on his grave all those years ago, about the way the stones had felt in his hands. He was thinking about the fragility of life and the stubbornness of love, about the way that a single night could define a lifetime and the way that a lifetime could be spent trying to make sense of it. Sarah reached over and took his hand, and he squeezed it gently. She did not say anything because she knew what he was thinking. They had been through too much together to need words. They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the evening, the birds settling in for the night, the distant hum of traffic, the children's laughter. The sky darkened and the first stars appeared, and somewhere far off a dog barked. It was a normal sound, the sound of home, and it was enough. In that moment, Tom understood something that he had never fully grasped before. The night of the Twisters had not been the end of their story. It had been a chapter, a terrible and transformative chapter, but the book was still being written. Every day since then had been a page, filled with small joys and small sorrows, with ordinary moments that were, in their own way, miraculous. He had learned to see the miracle in a cup of coffee, in a child's smile, in the way the light fell through the curtains in the morning. And he knew with a certainty that went beyond faith that as long as they had each other, as long as they remembered, they would never truly be lost. He looked up at the same stars that had shone on the night of the storm, the same stars that had watched over the destruction and the rebuilding. They were constant, unchanging, a reminder that some things endured, and he was grateful, so deeply grateful for every single one of them. The night of the Twisters was over, but the morning had come, and it would keep coming day after day, year after year, for as long as they were alive to greet it. And that, Tom thought, was the greatest gift of all. That was the story, that was everything.